John, Dr. Gulshan Kaul has emailed us this evening to say there's a growing divide between those in primary care who would like to be early adopters and implementers and those who caution against jumping in eyes wide shut and suggest waiting until the legal statute is decided and all nuts and bolts are in place. Is there a middle ground between the devil and the deep blue sea?
Yes, we're occupying it at present. There are many general practitioners involved in practice-based commissioning for whom this is not really a major step, and others who are yet to take part in anything like that, and for whom it will represent a major culture change. And whilst the proposals unwind and until the health bill is published, we are very much in that middle ground, I think, and yeah, it's a question in many respects of wait and see some of the detail.
Yeah, but obviously there are going to need to be some early adopters, aren't there? Do you get a sense of how many GPs are keen to be in that first wave?
I mean, yes, I mean, there are some, as John says, who are almost doing, I mean, they haven't got hard budgets, but they've been working very closely with their PCTs. They're already talking locally about the sort of format of their commissioning groups. Some are looking at a sort of federated structure and joining with others to get, on one hand, the economies of scale, on the other hand, the sort of local involvement and the local ownership. But I think until we see what comes out of the bill and we see some of the detail that we've been crying out for, then I think it's absolutely right that you don't formalise these bodies, but you can do a lot of the work that they will be doing, and you can even think about the sort of people you're going to employ to support these organisations
because
already.
If they're going to start shadowing next year, really, the early adopters, then the people who start shadowing next year are going to have longer to get used to it, but they're also going to be ironing out a lot of problems, aren't there? I mean, how would you feel as a GP? Are your local area going to be keen to be one of the first consortia?
I don't think they'll be keen to be the first because, you know, I don't think we've necessarily had the ideal relationships. I mean, I don't want to get too much involved in my own local situation, particularly as I spend most of my time down in London now, so I leave that to my colleagues up in Yorkshire. But I think there are areas where there are very well-formed commissioning groups where they have very good relationships with their PCTs because their PCTs have actually involved them in the sort of way that we hope, ideally, GPs and other clinicians will be involved in future consortia.
Okay. John, there are a lot of technical questions, really, about commissioning. Obviously, a lot of doctors are concerned that they get as much detail as they can as soon as possible. There's one here from Dr. Simon Piper, who's a GP in Guildford, Surrey, who says that given that general practice will face the consequences of any deficits that might occur, what is my incentive to participate in a consortia if, one, there is a local deficit already of 50 million plus, two, the commissioning payments to PCTs has been £65 per patient per annum, and that to the consortia will reduce to £9, and three, that the overall funding in general practice is at the whim of political serendipity.
Right, a lot of questions there. I think, well, first of all, we don't know much yet about the question of inherited debt. We don't know how that will be managed, and principally we don't know because some of the health service geography is going to change, and some of that debt will then be in different places. Also, some parts of the health service are in substantial surplus at present, and it's possible there might be some brokerage going on around that. Yeah. So we don't really know enough about that side of things. As to commissioning payments to PCTs, well, they aren't £65 per patient per annum. That's the total running costs of PCTs as regards the contracts they administer as well as the contracts they place for secondary care. And therefore they're not comparable with the figure of £9, which is being bandied around now as the probable management allowance.
And has that come out of the Department of Health, that £9?
I don't know. I think it's one of those figures that's got credence, and no one knows where it's come from. But I mean, it would not be a surprise to people if it was that order. I don't think it's a credible figure.
But there are going to be considerable savings, aren't there, that can be made that will allow for the difference?
Well, as John says, we don't know which. Well, we know that some functions of PCTs will go elsewhere. I mean, the whole governance of GP's own contracts will go to the National Commissioning Board. Exactly in what form, again, we don't know. There are other statutory functions around dentistry and that which will go elsewhere. GPs will not be involved, for instance, in commissioning maternity services. So there will be quite a few PCT functions which will not sit with commissioning consortia. We don't know yet exactly which ones will. There's still lack of clarity about the management allowance, but obviously part of the government's strategy is to very significantly reduce management. Now, my argument to that would be, well, if you really want to reduce management costs, get rid of the internal market, which is full of bureaucracy and transaction costs, and would actually save you a lot of money.
And there are a lot of questions about the internal market, which I'm going to ask you in a moment. But there is another question here from Dr. Harry Buckland, who is one of the people who is concerned, and there are a lot of doctors who are concerned, aren't there, saying, my concerns about the proposed appointment of GPs as commissioners are twofold. We lack the financial expertise and perhaps also the time to do a good job. Secondly, GPs should be a champion, ensuring that the local provider delivers proper and timely care. Insistence on this will inevitably conflict with his or her commissioning group loyalties, particularly if a substantial part of his income comes from the government. Do you feel that doctors have the right skills to run these consortia businesses?
Well, the first thing is doctors run practices, but they have practice managers, they have other staff to help them run it. So it's not a question of doctors necessarily having to have the skills themselves. I think doctors need the leadership skills and need to be able to bring along other people with them. And obviously there'll be different degrees of involvement from different doctors from different practices. There'll be some who will take a very leading role, a very hands-on role, and will give up some of their clinical time to do that. For the vast majority of doctors, I think they'll carry on very much working as they were before, but inputting into these sort of difficult decisions that will need to be made. I do recognise the problems for a lot of doctors who say, look, you know, my interest is the patient sitting in front of me. I don't want to get involved in these wider things, the potential conflict. And in an ideal world, that would be fine. But we've got to live in the real world where there are finite resources. And if you're going to abrogate responsibility for how they're going to deal with, then somebody else is going to make these decisions for you. And the biggest message we've had coming across from doctors over the years is it's people who don't actually know what they're talking about who are making these decisions, and we're not getting involved. So they can't have it both ways. They can't say, well, you know, we don't want to be involved because it's too difficult, but we don't like not being involved because people make their own decisions.
See, my concern as a patient is that the provision in your area and the commissioning that is carried out is only going to be as good as the business skills of the GPs in my area, so to speak. So there has to be some kind of generalisation of that, hasn't there, to avoid the classic postcode lottery?
Well, I hope it will partly be the commissioning skills, but it'll be the skills of the people they employ to actually do the nitty-gritty. And the other thing we have made clear is that we do not think that doctors should have a direct financial involvement in the success or otherwise of commissioning groups, because we don't want the accusation that doctors are making decisions purely to save the commissioning group money rather than in the best interests of the patient.
OK, Clive MacDonald asks, was the Conservative decision to introduce GP commissioning of secondary care based on any evidence of feasibility? To require that GPs add commissioning to their workload seems to assume that they have substantial amounts of time at their disposal. My memories of my days as a GP was that I was fully occupied. And also Judith King, who's a locum in South Staff, says the White Paper demands yet another wasteful reorganisation against a background of reduced spending on social care and rapidly increasing healthcare costs. It sounds like a toxic combination to me. John, is this the perfect storm?
Potentially, but not necessarily. Some of the evidence around commissioning of secondary care was there from fund holding, of course, and some of the evidence without hard budgets is there from practice-based commissioning, where it's working. So it's not a total absence of evidence, and obviously general practitioners have the day job, but they've also got to have a management allowance, enable them to backfill in the day job when they're doing consortium work. So in a way that's not necessarily going to be impact dramatically on their primary care responsibilities. Yes, in a sense, a wasteful organisation against a background of cuts, it clearly is, in a sense that it's going to cost money, and the NHS has been asked to save money. So it's
and we don't know how much money it's going to cost.
Well, we're told something of the order of 1.6, 1.7 billion, but you know,
that's like going.
Well, and I'm sure it's more scientific than that, but when you bear in mind some of the overrun costs in the health service, you know, things like IT and so forth, it's credible that it might be more than that. And it's against the background of saving £20 billion over 3 years. So one's got to be very cautious about the costs of it. It may not be a perfect storm. As I said at the beginning, it's a challenge. And the challenge is to use the tools that the government is giving GPs to mitigate the impacts of some of the things we don't like, principally the market and commercialisation.